We're really raising superheroes. What kind of world am I preparing my child for? Am I preparing them for today, which is now? Am I preparing them for 2030? Imagine if your kid could have the kind of focus like an Olympic athlete to deal with all the distractions of all the information coming in and to have emotional control. The information revolution is really changing the types of jobs and the types of ways that kids will conduct themselves into the future. So parents really need to focus in on that question first. We're really raising superheroes. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I'm not necessarily sure where in the world you're coming from. I understand from the organizers that we have approximately 4,000 participants from 6 different continents and a number of different time zones. So thank you very much for coming to spend a little bit of time with me today. I'm really looking forward to engaging with all of you. Before I start my presentations, I really like to put things into context. There's a great quote by Eddie Obeng, and he says, "We live our lives responding to a world that we know and understand that no longer exists." I want you to take 10 to 20 seconds and think about that as we create a little bit of context, and then I'm going to switch over to my slides. We'll go through the presentation. At the end, we're going to have a Q&A. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A, and I hope you enjoy. We live our lives responding to a world that we know and understand that no longer exists. Like I mentioned before, this is a really interesting way for us to create some context as we go through this journey together. And so let me tell you where this journey starts for me. In about 2009, my son is born, and I'm extremely excited. And most of you, if you have children, you may or may not have a picture like this. But in this picture, it looks very peaceful, it looks very calm. But what you're not seeing is that my hand is on his chest, and I'm actually panicked. I'm extremely panicked. I'm checking to see if he's breathing, and I cannot believe that the hospital has released a 2-day-old human being to his mother and myself. And when I get home, I sit down, and after trying to give him a bath, I start reflecting on what it means to be a father and what it means to be an educator. And I start, pushing my imagination way out into the future as to what that would look like. And if you're like me, it looks something like this. He grows up, he goes to school, a really good school. He goes to a good high school. He gets into a university, gets himself a really good job, buys himself a house, hopefully is able to take lots of vacations, gets married, and has children. And so, the connecting point between that is school. And so I start to think about what school looks like and walking him to school. On his first day of school, this is a picture that I snap of door number 4. And what happens on this first day of school? The door opens, the teacher comes out, all the students line up, and they go inside. The door closes, and that's it. I don't necessarily know what happens in there. At the end of the day, he comes out, and I say, "Son, how's your day?" And he says, "Good." That's all I have. And so because that's all I have, what do? I open up his backpack. And what am I expecting to find in his backpack? I'm expecting to find books. I'm expecting to find homework. I'm expecting to find pencil and paper. And when I open it up, what do I find? I find an agenda. And so I realized that the world of school looks very, very different than when I went to school. It looks very, very different than the type of school that sits in my imagination. And I start to ask myself, why is this? What is the purpose of school? So most of us know that the purpose of school is not just about the education of a child, but it's to create contributing members of society. How can we have our students grow up to be contributing members of society, to have a prosperous life, to increase the productivity of the region, and to generally have a happy life? And so, back at the very beginning of formal school, school looked a little something like this. And my class growing up looked a lot like this, although I am from the West Indies, so the kids looked a bit different, but you get the picture. The A's and the B's were those two rows to the right, and then the C's and the D's was everybody else. And that little boy at the top of the screen, that was a little boy that gave as much trouble as possible. And so the teacher sat that student as far away as humanly possible. But why did they do that? Well, they did that because the world of work looked like this. And so here you can see the A's and the B's sitting together as they're going through that person at the top, almost acting as a teacher. And what happened to the C's and the D's? Well, the C's and the D's worked in a place like this. And what was really interesting about this division is that the hope was that everybody would be able to contribute to life, to have that dream and to live that dream. At least that was the way that it was presented to countries in the West.
So what's really interesting with what we see is that we see that, maybe 150 years ago, school looks very, very familiar. We understand that school, we understand that world. As a matter of fact, now during COVID, a lot of classes have gone back to this particular model in terms of how the school's organized and how it was arranged. Now, I don't know about you, but I was in elementary school somewhere in the 80s. And what did school look like then? What was school like for me?
So fast forward to my childhood, which is somewhere around the 80s. You can tell that gentleman has about 1,000 pleats in his pants. But the school was designed reasonably the same. It looked very familiar. Sage on the stage in the front, the classroom lined up into rows, the A's and the B's separated from the C's and the D's. And typically, the world would look something like this if you lived in the West. So this is an office building. These are cubicles, an extremely happy place. Insert sarcasm there. And this is where the A's and the B's went. And this is where the C's and the D's went. The C's and the D's went into manufacturing. But what's really important, again, was that a person could grow up, become a contributing member of society, and hopefully have a reasonably prosperous and happy life. So what does the world of work start to look like today? Well, here's that manufacturing plant. This is a Tesla manufacturing plant. And what do you notice it's missing? I'll give you a moment. That question's rhetorical. What's missing is people. Actually, in this particular factory, there are about 4 people that monitor all the robots, but most of it is done by robots. And what about the office? Well, during the pandemic, there has been a 10-year leap in terms of digital transformation of work in 6 months. And so even though we're on a Zoom-like call, we're going to start seeing virtual reality options come up. At the Tomorrow Now Learning Lab, we actually have students across different schools, different places, different locations come into virtual reality, a room very much like this one, and interact. So we're going to start to see these changes. What about school? Well, this is just August. In August, Google rolled out 23 million digital learning platforms to teachers and students in India. And they have also entered into the post-secondary market. So in 6 months, they're offering a certificate, and that certificate will get the graduates to a $93,000 US job, and they will be able to do that job from any country on the planet. Now imagine being able to work from India, being able to work from countries in Africa. Imagine being able to work from South America, from the Caribbean, at 93,000 US dollars in the particular economies that those people live in. That's a profound shift.
So it leads us to our first statement. We'll live our lives responding to a world that we know and understand that no longer exists. So it really brings me to two questions. What world am I preparing students for? Am I preparing them for today, which is now, or am I preparing them for tomorrow? Are we preparing students for 2019 or 2030?
Most of us, when we think about school, we think about kids going from K to 12 and moving from 12 to some sort of post-secondary education as a badge of success. My contention is that's changing, and it's changing rapidly. So what world am I preparing my child for? For 2019 or 2030? Here are some reasons why your student's world will be profoundly different and why that matters. Now, if you grew up looking at television, you may or may not have seen a show called Star Trek. And Star Trek was a fantastic show where it was set in about 400 years into the future, and the space officers would use a device that looked very much like this one. And I found it quite fascinating because today we have devices like these. Of course, we know them as tablets or iPads, and we give them to our 2-year-olds. So, how did that happen? How are we here 400 years early? Well, because of this person. So this is Steve Jobs, and probably somewhere around 2006, a gentleman walked into his office by the name of Tony Fadell, and Tony Fadell had a great idea around the iPad, which morphed into the iPhone. And what was really interesting about the iPhone was it was the first time in human history that we had a store that was 24 hours that lived inside of our homes. And what that did, it encouraged thousands and thousands of developers to come in to compete into this app store, and that gave rise to billions and billions of devices being connected to the internet. So by the end of 2020, we'll have approximately 37 billion devices connected to the internet. And what does that mean in terms of information? If you have a look at the square on the left, you'll realize that was all the global data in 2008. And now the square on the right, you'll realize that we have 30 zettabytes of global data as of 2019, and it's growing exponentially. So to put that into context, when I was growing up, I would court my girlfriend, now wife, with something called a mixtape. And we would hang around the radio listening to and waiting for slow romantic ballads. And once we found those ballads, then we would put them onto a tape. And the machine that I used at the time had 135,000 transistors in it. Today, in my pocket, my iPhone 12 has an A14 Bionic chip, which has 11.8 billion transistors. That's able to do 11 trillion operations per second. 11 trillion operations per second. This has a profound impact when you consider that by next year, this time, there will be millions and millions of these phones in the world. And so, what does that allow us to do? Well, if you go back to my Star Trek analogy, you remember if you've seen Star Trek, this is Captain Picard. And Captain Picard would leave the brig and he would go into his ready room and he would walk to this box in the wall and he would say, "Computer, Earl Grey hot." And what would happen was a cup of tea would magically appear. Now, we're not exactly there as yet, but here's a 3D printer. And when you consider the power of our computers are doubling every 18 to 24 months in terms of processing power, in terms of storage, you realize that that's exponential. And you realize that where we are today will be exponentially further ahead 2 years from now and 2 years after that. Here's something that was really interesting. Under Armour is a large multi-million dollar company. They are the first sneaker company to make a 3D printed sneaker that was functional. What I found really interesting about the story is the white pair of running shoes at the top were made by a student in his home using a $1,500 3D printer. Think about what that means for manufacturing. Think about what it means for the world of work and how the world of work will impact K to 12 school. Here we see Andrew Hessel. He's a really interesting person. He was talking to me in an interview around 3D printing DNA and its implication on health, coupled with mixed reality. Here we see a gentleman using mixed reality glasses. Here's 2 years into the future. Those glasses have now shrunk in terms of size, but increased in terms of functionality. Imagine what happens when we start to converge those. Imagine the possibilities. Here we see two students in two different locations looking at a brain across virtual reality space. This is today. This is what work looks like. Once we take all of that, we can combine it with artificial intelligence and machine learning, and the entire workforce will be digitally transformed. This is what that acceleration of growth looks like. Now, you can see the printing press all the way to the left. It took about 150 years between the printing press and the first Gutenberg Bible. And now things are speeding up at an exponential rate, and we are at the top of this exponential curve. This is called the fourth industrial revolution. If you are not familiar with the fourth industrial revolution, I definitely suggest that you Google it and get an understanding of what it is. It will profoundly impact the world of education, the world of work, and transform many, many of our paradigms.
So, what's really interesting about the fourth industrial revolution is that it's not one technology, it's not two technologies, it's a number of technologies converging all at once into one particular moment that really allows us to step into a new age. We are now in the augmented age.
And what's become very obvious to me is that we're now raising superheroes. And I don't mean superheroes like aliens from outer space that fly, but I mean superheroes that are very much like the Black Panther, very much like Iron Man, very much like a Sister Shuri, where they use technology and intelligence and converge those two things to create something that's extraordinary. Here's the point. Now, this is from the movie Iron Man. And in this movie, we see Tony Stark with 3D technology and virtual reality that was designed for a billionaire. And here we are just 2 years later. This is Microsoft HoloLens. And when these came out, they were about $3,500. And now, here is a platform that I use at the Tomorrow Now Learning Lab with a headset that costs just about $300. There is a company called Zappa that is making a augmented reality and virtual reality headset that'll cost just $40. So we can see that the cost of computing is going down, the functionality is going up, and it starts to transform and knock down gates. Once we converge all of these technologies together, once we converge them, each one of them being a technology that could be paradigm shifting on its own, once we have this perpendicular convergence, we realize that the world that we know is going to be very, very different. Here, what you're looking at is generative design, machine learning, artificial intelligence, building a bridge on its own. This is autonomous. So, as educators, we have to free ourselves from one of the fundamental traps. And one of the fundamental traps is optimizing form versus function. And what do I mean by that? Let me give you a practical example. I grew up in Trinidad and Tobago, and that's a small country in the Caribbean. And I moved from Trinidad and Tobago to Toronto. And when I moved, I had a suitcase that looked very much like this one. And now, when I travel through the airport, I have a suitcase that's on wheels. And I wondered, why did it take so long for us to put wheels on a suitcase? The wheel is probably one of the first inventions. We've been traveling by air for a long time. It must have taken maybe 30 or 40 years, but we have different colors of suitcases, different handles. We were optimizing for form versus function. I believe that we have a very similar challenge in education where we're optimizing for form. The form of our school is a big factory like model that feeds a factory like premise of work. And as we can see over the last few minutes, the future of work is transforming at an exponential rate. And therefore, we have to consider how we prepare students for that exponential change. We're going to have to start thinking about function over form. So, what does the future of work look like? This is one of my esteemed colleagues. Her name is Heather McGowan. She's brilliant. If you don't follow her, look her up on LinkedIn. But this is a model that she put out. And the old economy looked like what you see on the top. What we did was we educated ourselves approximately for the first 25 years. Then we entered into the world of work. And after we left the world of work, we retired. Our average lifespan was around 75. Now you can see the new economy is we are going to learn, engage, learn, engage, learn, engage. We may retire, recondition, come back, start a business. It's going to be very, very different. So we really have to consider, instead of assuming that school should be a K to 12 linear that gets us into post secondary. And then once we get to post secondary, we go into the world of work. We have to consider being able to engage, learn immediately, right away, all the time. This presentation, in of itself, was a project that was done by one of the students at Tomorrow Now Learning Lab. And it's a real world project with real world consequences. And what's interesting is many of the challenges that I had along the way were corrected by an 11-year-old student. We live our lives responding to a world that we know and understand that no longer exists. So the economy changes. We're moving from a complicated economy to one that is more complex. You'll notice that you'll see, there's certain methodologies and mindsets, the agile mindset, design thinking, all of these. But instead of having them on the fringe of school, how do we bring them to the center, to the core of what school is and what learning is? Here are the top 10 skills for 2025 according to the World Economic Forum. I'll leave that up for a moment so you can have a look. While you're having a look, ask yourself, is this at the core of your educational organizations? Is this the core of your classes? Is this at the core of your country? Or is it on the periphery? We are moving from a world that is standardized to a world that is personalized at scale. So we're going to have education transform itself to be personalized at scale. Are we preparing students for 2019 or 2030?
Thank you very much. I appreciate you spending the time with me, and I'm really looking forward to any questions, comments, feedback. If you would like to reach out to me and get in contact, the best place to do that is LinkedIn, Dwayne Matthews, OCT at LinkedIn. If you'd like to know more about the Tomorrow Now Learning Labs, reach out to me, send me a DM. I'd love to connect with you and speak a little bit more. Look forward to hearing your questions and comments. Okay, one last thing. I needed to say a big, big thank you to one of our students at Tomorrow Now Learning Lab. Did a fantastic job at putting this together. The idea and the concept for us to go digital, to use the VR, all his ideas, we had to get together and do this inside of what we call a Tomorrow Now Learning Lab 24-hour project, where we have to have a real project with real consequences, win or lose, either lessons learned or a big win. And so I just wanted to say a big shout out to him and a massive, massive thank you. Okay, questions and answers.